Thanks to everyone for joining us for this week's Career and Identity Intersections Dialogue. This week's topic is power dynamics in the workplace. Before we get started today, we're going to go over a couple of virtual communal agreements just to make sure we're on track. Go ahead and mute your microphone if you're not one of the presenters. That'll just make sure the audio quality stays good. You can feel free to turn on your closed captions. That'll make sure that you catch every word of everything people are sharing. You can choose to keep your video on or off today, whatever you're comfortable with. Our presenters are going to be on both audio and video. If you have any questions that you want to ask the panelists today, just go ahead and drop them in the chat box, and we'll go ahead and ask those during the Q&A section at the end. We are actively recording this as of now for the use on the Career Services website and social media platforms, so everybody is aware of that. I also went ahead and dropped a link in there, so if anybody wants to give us some feedback on how today's sessions went, you can just drop that link in your browser and it'll take you to the event survey. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and introduce today's moderator. Today we are joined by Kevin Wright, who is the Assistant Director for Student Diversity in UNLV's Student Diversity and Social Justice Office. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kevin.
All right, thank you, Lynn, so much. I really appreciate it. And I really do appreciate the panelists that were able to join us this afternoon for today's Thursday Thoughts about navigating workplace dynamics and also with career readiness. So we're going to jump straight into the questions. And first and foremost, I would love for you all to introduce yourselves, your name, where you work, and then what does your role look like, and as well as like your day-to-day functions. And we can definitely go in the order of the list of like what is presented on the screen. And then as we ask more questions in the future, we can continue to go in that order, or we can do a popcorn method where one person speaks if they feel comfortable, and then they can popcorn it over to someone else that also may feel comfortable answering the question. So starting with Vito.
All right, thank you, Kevin. My name's Vito Honey. I work at J West America Company. We're an LED lighting manufacturer and distributor in the U.S. and worldwide. I also am a set grip and electric for the Local 80, which is the film grip union. My current role at J West America is as an e-commerce and social media manager, which makes me a manager of types. We're small thanks to the pandemic. We had to let some people go, but I would be in charge of all the online overseeing how we look online overall. And day to day, during the current pandemic, we're doing a lot of website maintenance. We're launching a couple other websites. So I'm plugging away at a computer all day these days.
All right. I'm assuming that means I'm next, right? So my name's Alexandra Hoingwa. I go by Alex. So throughout, if you want to address me by Alex, that's totally fine. And where I work, I'm actually located on the Hopi Reservation, which is in the northern part of Arizona. And so my organization here is a nonprofit in the local community, and we're known as the Hopi Education Endowment Fund. And so what I do here at the Endowment Fund is I'm their marketing and special events manager. And so much like yourself, Vito, I am plugged into a computer 24/7. So definitely is something that I'm familiar with. My day-to-day work, what that looks like for me is really managing the social media aspect of our organization, so all of our platforms. And right now we currently use Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. As a part of that, I do all of the marketing for outreach. So whether that's new brochures, which we just got done revamping our mission and vision, which meant revamping everything in the office. Things like business cards, our website, our social media, all of that had to be updated. And then on top of that, the special event side is just trying to help out my team and make sure we're making successful events happen in order to fundraise for our organization. So a lot of what we do here is fundraising. I just get to be the visual side of all of that here for the HEAF. So that's me in a nutshell and what I do here out in Hopi. Nice to meet you all.
Hi, my name is Kat Claus, and I use the pronouns she, her, and hers. And I am the program manager for the Wisconsin LGBT Chamber of Commerce. And so I oversee all of our signature programs, and my job has drastically changed during COVID. We do a lot of supportive programming to help businesses. And since COVID hit, I've been doing one-on-one resource consultations with businesses, and I was selected for an economic fellowship to do business recovery in the state of Wisconsin. So everybody else is talking about shorter days during COVID. I'm kind of the opposite of that. And in my former life, I was a teacher. So at my current job, I do a lot of mentorship programs and education outreach in colleges and schools.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to meet you all. My name is Lisa Kappel. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I am the program coordinator for campus activities. And I work in the student involvement and activities office at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. So huge mouthful, right? So thank you all again so much for being here. What I primarily do in my role is I advise a student organization, and it's called the Campus Activities Board. And what they do is they put on large scale and small scale events for our students on campus. So very fortunate to be advising a great group of students, putting on some really awesome, fun social events that help build affinity to UNLV, as well as help them create a sense of belonging on campus. So it's very gratifying, very fulfilling work. My day-to-day is filled, just like how everyone has said, filled with being in front of a computer as I'm continuing to work remotely. It's mostly with meeting with students who are putting on events. I advise around 8 to 10 students who all each put on different events of different scales. So all, planning and behind the scenes work and empowering them to put on these events is primarily what I do. I also serve on different committees that do different work as well. So I'm meeting with different folks all across campus doing a lot of great, meaningful work in their respective positions as well. So again, very gratifying, very fulfilling work, very busy work too. Putting on virtual events is definitely different than in-person events, but still very, very fun. Thank you so much for having me. That's all about me.
All right, thank you to our panelists for those introductions. And now we're going to get into some more questions. So for this portion of the session, we're going to talk about experience. So in regards to power dynamics, how do power dynamics influence the culture of your place of employment? And in what ways are power dynamics discussed in your place of employment? And again, it doesn't have to go in the order that we just had. This is, again, challenge by choice, again, trying to share your insight that you feel is most necessary. So who would like to start?
I'll go ahead if nobody else is interested. So power dynamics influence the culture in my workplace, actually, I think positively, because we have what I would call a two-way power dynamic. So when I started this job about a year ago and I was training, I have a fabulous boss, which I'm very fortunate to have, and hasn't always been the case in power dynamics, who sat me down and described the organizational hierarchy of my organization. So president, CEO, how it goes down the chart, and said that although that looks this way on paper, that's not exactly the way, decisions are always made. So for example, if there's something where I might be an expert on business grants and loans, I'm deferred to for that, despite the fact that I might not be the most senior person on staff. And power dynamics discussed in my workplace have actually been really frequently. We always discuss this at work meetings, and in a really authentic way where I feel like if I had a concern, I could take it to my coworkers or my boss, and that it would be heard. And I think that that is especially because it started with a strong foundation of what it means to have power dynamics. Of course, the boss always has to have the final say on things, but explaining how decisions are made was a big way that kind of opened up those doors of communication.
I'll go next. My current job, the power dynamics are not the greatest. I work for a small company, and it's kind of more what the owner says goes. And when it comes to the rest of us, I think we try to shift power a lot, and there's no real hierarchy as to who manages who does that. It's really more at the end of the day what the boss says goes, which affects us negatively because sometimes we'll end up in arguments about things or give criticism or try to do certain things that are just not good for the overall project or whatever, the whole morale of the team. And also with the power dynamics of the company, it comes down to everyone wants their voice to be heard, or some people don't want other people's voices heard if it affects what they'll have to do. So if I'm doing something on the website, but my coworker is saying all this stuff that I know will influence what I do, but it won't directly affect the outcome of what he has to do, it'll only make my job harder. That power dynamic, it becomes, I think it's the fixing for a toxic work environment. On the flip side, when you're working on set at a film studio, I mean, what the producer says goes, but at the end of the day, the power dynamics are actually pretty healthy if you have the right crew together, because everyone wants to get out of there on time. Everyone wants the project to go well. In the film industry, we always say safety first. So when you first get together with your grip and lighting crew, you know who's in charge of this, you know who's in charge of who, you know who the crew bosses are. So it just makes it'll be stressful at times because, I mean, we are working on a movie, but we know who we can go to, we know what can be discussed, and at the end of the day, there's always lines for clear communication. So I always find it interesting that the film world versus my current professional job are which one's more toxic than the other.
I can go next. Oh, sorry, Alex. Would you like to go ahead? So like I had mentioned before, I work in our student involvement and activities office. And so as a result, it's it's heavy student facing. So I advise an organization that puts on a lot of events and programs, and I have colleagues who advise fraternity and sorority life, advise student government, help registered student organizations. So again, it's very, very student facing, and we do a lot of fun social programming. And I think as a result, that has brought in and has drawn in people who are also very fun, very social, very passionate about their work. And so that has definitely helped create a very fun and a very healthy work environment for myself personally. A majority of people in my office are a little bit on the younger side, so similar in age to me, around mid to older 20s. I've been in my role for a little over a year now. And it's been really, really great. What I love about folks in my office, especially upper level administration, is that they are very intentional about getting to know us personally and professionally. My supervisor, especially, we have a great working relationship as well as a great personal relationship. He has told me, and he actually said this in a one-on-one earlier this week, is that he really, really cares about the person more than the position. And that really means a lot to me as his supervisee. And so I can tell that a lot of people, or all of the folks I work with in my office, are the same way, which has been really great. It's in the ways that power dynamics are discussed, it's a little bit more on the implicit and direct side, and I can see kind of how this manifests in terms of our meetings and how the director of my office is the one to lead our meetings, but she makes it a point to be very intentional about having check-ins at the beginning of our meetings. We have fun activities. For example, we're doing trivia this semester, and we're doing rounds of trivia before we get started with our meetings. And she, again, has been very intentional about structuring our meetings so that everyone has their voice. And so everyone is talking, everyone is sharing and updating about their work, as well as providing feedback and input on other things. We have an open door policy in our office, and so I feel comfortable whether that's going to my supervisor or going all the way up to the top to our executive director. So like I said, very close and personal and professional relationships. What I really, really enjoy and really respect about colleagues of mine, especially upper level administration, and I think that this has really helped in terms of navigating power dynamics, is that they are very open and honest people, and they admit when they mess up. So they acknowledge when they make mistakes. And I think as someone, for me, who's a very young professional who looks up and is looking at people who are in authority in these positions, and I'm like, wow, these people are perfect. These people can do no wrong. They, by being vocal, by being open and honest, they are showing that they're human, just like me. And I think in that way, they make themselves more approachable to someone who's, I'm the youngest colleague, I'm the youngest staff member, I'm the most recently joined staff member. So as someone like me, you know, going to my executive director, who's very open and honest and approachable due to how they're sharing about themselves, how they're sharing about their work, all of these things. It makes it very, very easy. It creates really healthy, effective relationships for me. So very thankful to be in an office where I feel this way. I know not a lot of people do. So I consider myself very, very lucky.
I'd like to say I'm in a unique situation, and so which makes my office environment different. And so for myself, just hearing everyone and their remarks about their own office and power dynamics and how that plays out, I'm grateful for those of you who've got a healthy one and also can totally relate to the unhealthy one. So I know that for myself, it's kind of in between, if I were to be truly honest with how the power dynamics are here in our team and in our environment, because we work with a lot of different things and a lot of different people around us. It's not just our team. Our team is small. We're only really like a team of 5. And so I am in my 2-year mark with my team working here, and I came from a drastically different working environment, moving over and shifting over to this smaller environment. Basically went from a team of 30 to a team of 5. And so that was a huge difference. And it was like, wow, okay, what am I going to do now? Because decision-making processes are totally different now. And so as far as how it influences the culture, when I hear that word culture, because it ties into not only just the culture of the office, but also we work out here in Hopi, and we're heavily influenced by that background, by that tribe. And so with an office of 5 who are all Hopi and also very involved in their communities, you're not only tying in power dynamics on a hierarchy scale, so like, director, or if you have assistant director, you have program assistants, things like that. But we also have your power dynamics in the community. So, we have different people of influence in our community, and sometimes that comes and plays a role in the office and how we handle things too. So it's not just a simple hierarchy thing. It's also how do we recognize ourselves in the office, as well as tying in our own culture, because it influences the office culture itself. And so that's super different and unique to us here, because I've never had that happen to me. I went from being the only Native person on my staff and the only person from Hopi, for that matter, to, oh, my whole staff is Hopi. So, that definitely plays a role there. And quite honestly, power dynamics are new. They're new. They're not really talked about. It's not easily discussed in where I'm at right now. And it's because there's a lot of influence coming from other areas. And so right now, when that comes to making decisions or teamwork or coming together, it's really how can we best approach these things, even though we have all of these other influences behind our head, and almost separating yourself. You really have to separate that cultural side of yourself from your place of employment. And that's kind of hard to do here out in Hopi, for a lot of places employment, not just where I'm at. And so I was talking to my coworker actually the other day, and she goes, "What are power dynamics?" I was like, "I know, I'm going to talk about it today, Deanna." She's my coworker. And she goes, "I never really sat to think about that." And I was like, yeah, it's probably going to be new for a lot of offices out in here, especially because we're so small. But right now, what I see is, yes, our director has overall say over different items in the office. We also speak to a board membership of 20 people, so they also have an influence on things too. And they also probably have even more of an influence than our director. So a lot of things come from that area as well, which is something to take into account with our nonprofit status. So that's different and unique to us. So I would explain that in that way, yeah, for here at the Heath.
Thank you all for your perspective on that. And I actually appreciate knowing that your places of employment have some type of normalcy around discussing it, or at least addressing it, or at least acknowledging that it is there, both in potentially positive ways and unhealthy ways. So definitely thank you for that perspective. We're going to transition to now the next portion of this session, which is about identity. So the questions are, how do your selling identities inform how you navigate power dynamics? And what has been your experience with navigating power dynamics in light of that?
I'll go first again, if that's okay. So my experience with navigating power dynamics up until my current job in the last year has been awful. Much like a lot of my co-speakers here, I didn't have anybody who explained to me what power dynamics were or how to properly navigate them and prepare me for the professional world. I wish there was a class on it in college, or at least a discussion. And so I had a lot of workplaces that were toxic where I didn't feel comfortable bringing something to my boss, or I would just get email with directions, and the power dynamics were everything top down. There was never an ability to say, hey, I have this great idea. Or if I did try to do that, it wasn't always accepted. That just wasn't the way it works. So they were traditional 9-to-5 jobs without that open floor to bring up concerns. And I think that how my identities inform how I navigate power dynamics has been a part of it. So I am a queer woman, and I've worked in positions where I wasn't comfortable being out. And by that, I mean, I didn't tell my coworkers that I identified as queer. And I kind of felt like I wasn't able to talk about my personal life. And as an extension of that, I didn't feel comfortable that I was accepted in my workplace. So I always kind of felt guarded, even in my, professional work. I kind of felt like I had to put on this mask and this own identity to get through the day. Like when I, clocked in and walked into my office, I wasn't Kat, my vibrant person. I was Kat, the employee that worked at this corporate company. And I think that made me more conducive to not questioning power dynamics and not starting these really great conversations that can have with your superiors or your coworkers about maybe reworking that chart. So power dynamics doesn't need to be top down. Maybe it's a circle. Maybe it's a committee to bring things. And I think that it's really wonderful we're having this conversation. And I think that work culture for people who are younger than I am, it'll change drastically in the next 10 years. And I'm so excited because it is a long overdue change.
I can go next. I think for me, I alluded to this already in the last comments that I made. It's being a woman out here, yes, and then also being Native American, but also being Hopi. And so that identity itself definitely shapes who you are in the community as well as within your role in your job. And so there's ceremonies out here, which are, things that Hopi people participate in. And actually, we have certain roles that are designated to you within those. And so as being a lady, out here, that holds a certain type of power to it. If you are a male within those ceremonies, that also holds a certain type of power to it. So in some ways, we are kind of what I like to call old school here out in Hopi, because we still definitely have those, especially like gender roles are very prevalent here out in Hopi. And which I'm aware of, and also as something that will probably change over time, because I definitely see a younger up and coming generation that is more aware of themselves. They're advocating for different things. They want roles to be more equal and more available to one another. So that is changing things. And so taking on the identity that I have right now, it definitely, some of the things I say are not valid, especially within a male presence, and that can be difficult because they're used to having that kind of power within our community. And so again, it kind of goes into how that happens in the workplace. And so it's kind of a struggle right now to figure out how we're going to divide those items, because in bigger organizations and other roles, and much like yourselves, that probably wouldn't be prevalent, and that probably wouldn't be the same. So who knows, that individual might struggle if they go from one place of employment to another. And so I know that here, that's something we're working on. And I do believe our younger generations they're gonna be the spearheading folks to really take that on as they move forward. And then as far as my own personal experience with navigating power dynamics, I was a boss at some point, and I recently have become someone who is now the boss of me. And so that changed. It was definitely different being a supervisor and going to someone who's being supervised right now. And so when I had a team, I realized I was taking on a certain power when I became a boss, quote unquote. And so, being a boss was scary. I was terrified. I was wondering, how am I going to influence my team? And hopefully it's positively and not negatively. And so I want them to carry good characteristics moving forward, not bad ones learned from me, because they're technically learning from me, right? And so at that point, that's my only experience personally. As far as with others of authority and their own power dynamics, it's really just trying to build a dialogue and understanding. If they're unaware of their own power dynamic, it's important to call that person out and say, hey, you're a person of influence and you are a big deal right now. And you should be doing A, B, C, D, or I suggest A, B, C, D. And hopefully they have open ears to listen to you for that. And so that's here in a nutshell.
Nice. I can go next. Or Alex, do you want to go next?
No, it's okay. It's all you.
Okay. Yeah, as I said before, the power dynamics in my current workplace, I'm actually looking for another full-time employer, mainly because of the power dynamics of the whole situation. In my fraternity, which I'm very active in, I'm alumni chapter president. I also sit on numerous committees nationally, and the power dynamics there, I identify as female to male transgender. And something I found over the years, especially because my fraternity's been the one constant thing, even though jobs have come and gone. I think my power dynamic changed from when I identified as just a butch or lesbian to coming out as transgender. I think I got more assertive. People started to actually listen to me more, even before I became assertive when I transitioned, because some people met me post my transition. It's something I try to identify with, especially when I'm mentoring younger alumni or collegiates who are going to be on our college campuses or be, active in our fraternity nationally as volunteer leaders, is trying to make them feel they can speak out, trying to make them feel have, they can be assertive without being pushing their weight around, so to say. In my position right now, I'm someone they would say, I've been told I work outside the fraternity system a lot, even though I'm part of the fraternity system. There's people I have to check in with that are my regional directors and provincial vice presidents, but I always, the power dynamics with one of them in particular, I don't know if it's a personal thing. I don't know if it's this person likes to push around their weight, but I have to find ways to make sure I get my point across to do what I need to do, but also respect their position, respect what authority they have, and also recognize when they do not have authority. In some ways, we're like coworkers, but in some ways, this person is also like my boss. So identifying when, and I see it in my work life as well, identifying when someone, you have to listen to them and do what they say and feel your way about it, versus when you need to listen to them and either apply what they're saying, change up what they're saying and apply it, or say respectfully, thank you for the feedback and push on with what you were doing. I see a lot now, honestly, with this current year, 2020, I've seen power dynamics within our fraternity, within my workplace. It's being talked about more, especially with how people identify, whether it be race, their religion, their gender or sexual identity. It's being talked about more, so I'm kind of optimistic for what 2020 and future years are going to bring, with more people of color coming into power or using their power dynamics to get their point across, or people who are female, as some of you have pointed out. Or I think this generation is, as they would say, really woke to the power dynamics that are going on, and they're ready to make things more equal and also make their voices heard.
Thank you all so much for sharing. And I can really resonate and relate to what Alex and Vito had shared. I would love to share a little bit more about me. I was born and raised in Houston to an immigrant Indian family. And when I was 8 years old, I moved to Chennai, India, where I lived there for 10 years. That's where my parents had lived. And so I grew up primarily in India. A lot of my formative years were in India. And then I moved back to Texas to go to Texas A&M University for my undergrad and grad school. And so I say all of that to say that I was really raised in a culture where you're taught to value authority and to never question authority. And again, it was a very formative, time in my life, and I grew up thinking this way. And so I really never had a voice for myself. I never really knew who I was, who I wanted to be. I never learned how to share my voice and how to do that effectively until I came to college, and I was living on my own, and navigating a completely different culture, a completely different, country. And I was really able to develop my own voice. And I think as a result of living in India for very long, that has definitely affected how I navigate power dynamics. So my salient identities are being an Indian woman. And I have found that I tend to be a little bit more introverted in larger settings. I prefer to sit back and observe and internally process when things are being told to me or things are being shared. And I share when necessary. And so when I moved to UNLV, very different than Texas and Texas A&M. Vegas is very different than tiny College Station, Texas. I really wanted to take the first year that I was here to learn more about institutional culture, learn more about office culture, and as I continued to do that, as well as surrounded myself with people who thought like me, who had similar lived experiences. For example, Kevin is one of those people that I lean on both personally and professionally. I surrounded myself with people who empowered me and showed me ways for me to utilize my voice. I've been able to do that a lot more now. I can definitely say that I am not the same person as I was when I first started out at UNLV. And that is all thanks to the experiences that I've had, as well as the people that I've surrounded myself with, both inside and outside of the office. Like I shared earlier, my office has been very supportive of me and of each other. And I recognize that. I recognize that privilege. I'm not going to lie when I say that those feelings of nervousness still arise, and I'm hesitant to speak up, especially when it comes to, talking to upper level administration. But something that I've really tried to learn is to really push myself out of my comfort zone and use my voice, because my voice is valuable. And it's something that I really, really try to do with my students and when I advise them. And for example, we have weekly meetings with my executive board team. And while I'm attending, I'm not leading the meeting. I'm having my president lead the meeting. I'm structuring our agendas so that everyone gets to share all of those things. I have check-ins with my students, both when I'm in a one-on-one with them or we're in group settings. So I really make it a point to have my students and empower my students to share their voice, because their voice is so valuable and people won't know what they're thinking unless they share it. I really am trying my best to be very intentional about that, especially since I grew up feeling this way, having these thoughts due to the nature of the culture I was raised. So I'm, really, really doing my best to advocate for myself and use my own voice, as well as helping my students find their own voices and using their own voices as well.
Kat, I just want to check to see if you wanted to add anything or.
Add anything else? Because I already went, but I do have one quick thing to re-mention. That's okay, Kevin. It is a long day. One thing that I wished I mentioned the first time I was talking is the opposite of Lisa, have always been an outspoken woman. I'm from a small farm rural town in Wisconsin that I like to joke has more cows and city limits than people. So local women, we're a little bit hard to come by culturally. And I actually had to learn the opposite. I can still be true to myself and be vocal, but also be humble and know how and when to say the things. Because when I first started at a corporate sales job that I was at temporarily, the first thing I did is I walked in on the first day and I was in a meeting and I was like, why don't we do this? That was the first thing they ever said. They knew nothing about me, brand new, first day. And granted, I still think my idea was great. But I had to learn the diplomatic and the correct way to bring up ideas in power dynamics. There's a social etiquette. Just like there's social etiquette in everything we do. When you're going up the staircase, you walk on the right-hand side. It's the same way in the corporate world. And I think I took for granted why some of those things and customs are in place. There is a reason for it. And also that I could harness them and use them for good while still being true to myself.
Thank you for that. And I apologize for not realizing that you already spoke. I had my internet cut out like 3 times while y'all were speaking, so I apologize. But we'll definitely transition to the next portion of our session, and that is about addressing barriers. So the questions are, what conversations do you recommend people should have to address what conversations do you recommend people should have to address the potential barriers power dynamics create? And how can folks who hold privileged identities use that privilege to support others who hold historically marginalized identities?
I can start us off.
That.
Sticking with the fraternal side of this for a moment, for those that are in power, some people like to say that I have a voice in our fraternity. I highly disagree with that. But when I am told this, I know there are certain groups in the country, whether it be a chapter, whether it be minority groups or something like that, I try to give them the platform of, hey, you should talk to so-and-so and make the introduction for them so that they can have their voices heard. Because me, especially as young people, as college students, a lot of times they don't feel they can go up to people in their administration. They don't feel they can go up to their fraternity leaders and say, this is my idea or this is what's going on, because there's like this invisible line, even as a young collegiate, I saw that you don't, when the term was used, you don't talk when the big brothers are talking. And it was basically when the older bros, whether that be they age-wise are older or have been fraternity longer, are talking, you don't talk. Same as when I was at university and at some of my film gigs, when the more seasoned people are around, you don't talk. If they address you, you talk, but you don't impede into that. I think it's, being in a situation where you say, hey, Kevin, you have a good idea about this, or you have experience with that. Why don't you tell the group about it? Sometimes that an icebreaker is needed for especially young folk or people that are in marginalized communities, such as the LGBT community or immigrant or Latino or Black communities. I'm trying to choose my wording here cautiously, but a lot of times people say they don't need the cis male white savior to get them a seat at the table. But if you are that cis male white male at the table that can bring them to the table, I think almost sometimes you have an obligation to do so, especially when you identify that there's something lacking there and that you can do something to help it. And in your own groups of trying to make barriers, kind of like with what I said earlier, try to bring other people into the conversation, and also make your voice heard about potential ways to break the power dynamics or improve power dynamics, or at least communicate the power dynamics that you see. One example was, I told one of my leaders that a lot of people feel like when these 3 people talk, they can't put input in because they've been on this committee so long. Or when my head busboy was trying to figure out how we were going to rig a car mount for a feature film, there were a lot of young guys that had that experience, but because 3 other guys were telling them to do it a specific way, which in this case was not going to help us with our budget, they didn't feel they could express it because they were the younger guys. They didn't have one of them had a lot of experience, but he was still only 20 at the time, and these guys were in their 30s. So kind of identifying identifying where someone else could come from, and also, if you have the power to do so, bring the other person into it.
I can go next. So in terms of conversations I recommend people having, I can definitely speak from personal experience when I say that conversations that lead to creating safe environments for people have been very, very effective, and have led to open and honest conversations between folks of different power differentials. So for example, I really do my best to create safe environments with my students by, like how I mentioned earlier, I always make sure to check in with my students, and I give the time and the intention to making sure that they're good. I also do my best to set expectations from the very beginning, whether that's for a meeting. We have retreats at the beginning of every semester where I always make sure that my students come prepared with expectations for themselves, for each other, and for me. I hold myself to the same standard as my students, and then I come with expectations for each other as well as for myself. So making sure that my students know that I care for them. I come from a place of love and support by checking in, making sure that they're okay, as well as making sure that we are setting expectations for each other and for me from the very beginning to hold each other accountable. And from what I've observed, both as a student, being in a situation where this is happening, as well as being on the other side, advising student leaders and doing these things, it's been very, very, very effective. And that has led to very amazing, open and honest communication. Whenever I'm having one-on-ones with students and we're sharing ideas for events and I share something, my students aren't afraid to tell me that it's a bad idea. And I'm thankful for that, and I welcome that because I'm not perfect. And so, I'm very, thankful that we've all contributed to an environment where we all feel comfortable and my students feel seen and they feel heard. Again, going back to sharing your voice, I always make sure that I mention and I always say that you need to use your voice. Your voice is valid. So please share it as much as you can. So I definitely think that creating safe environments for people to have open and honest conversation is very important when it comes to addressing potential power differentials. In terms of folks who hold privileged identities, supporting others who hold historically marginalized identities, this is such an important question to ask. So thank you so much for asking this question. I think first, people need to do a lot of learning and reflection and self-education, as well as acknowledging the privilege that they have, and then doing the work, right? And so, for example, we'll talk about my organization. The Campus Activities Board was formerly known as the Rebel Events Board. And the term rebel has been very problematic for the UNLV community, for all students of color, staff of color, specifically our Native population. And we've heard a lot of feedback regarding the use of this word rebel. Our mascot, who originally was a Confederate general. There are some problematic things that UNLV has had in the past and has adopted. And knowing this and knowing that my organization that has this huge platform, that has this huge voice, that hundreds of thousands of students come to our events, I knew that it was our responsibility to utilize the privilege that we had to make change. And so we addressed it. We changed our name to make it more inclusive, not only to make our organization more inclusive, but we've changed names of events. We've changed names of positions that have had problematic terms in it, because we want to make sure that we are creating an environment where all people feel included. I have my students share their pronouns when it comes to introducing themselves at events. I have them share videos with subtitles. I have them use gender neutral language. My students know that I'll call them out when they say things like "you guys" in group settings, but I feel comfortable and able to do that, and my students receive it well, because again, tying back to safe environments, open and honest communication, it's all coming from a place of love and care. So very fortunate to be, in an environment that is like this, as well as advising an organization that has this privilege, and advising students who recognize the privilege that they hold being officers in this organization, and creating change and using their platform for good.
I agree with both the things that have said. I work with about a year. I work with 1,000 businesses. So I get to look at other businesses and organizations' power dynamics. And some of the ones I work with are like small, tiny coffee shops, all the way up to corporate partners with our chamber. And there's just one misconception that ties into both of these questions. The idea that if there are problems, that's the time to address power dynamics. And I think everybody's already done a really great time of saying that power dynamics is something you should start with. I'm a bit of an idealist. And I really think that even if you don't like your boss, if your boss was a surgeon, would you trust them with your life? And that is the litmus test I have. I've had bosses I dislike. I disagree with every decision that they had. But at the end of the day, I think they generally care about me and they care about the organization enough where if for whatever magical world, I would trust them with my life. And I think that starting with that great understanding that even if you disagree, everybody has the same thing in mind, I think goes a long ways. And I don't mean to shame our smaller businesses, but I think that when you're with somebody every day, those conversations kind of get taken for granted. Like, oh, like so-and-so's desk is 10 feet away from mine. Why would there a power dynamic issue? But if they never had it addressed or modeled how you bring up an issue or say, hey, is there something you want to talk to me about, and give them that opening, those conversations are never going to be had. And just quickly on how folks who are privileged can use their identities, I think being privileged means you have a duty and responsibility to elevate voices that need to be heard. And voices that need to be heard can change in the context. So I'm a cis white woman. My voice doesn't need to be heard about race. But if we're talking about LGBTQI equality, as a queer woman, my voice does need to be amplified. And a quick anecdote about that, I wrote a bill last year in the legislature, and I was presenting it. And as I got up to present it, some man decided to talk about what I wrote. And when I went to correct him, he started arguing with me without checking who I was. So somebody mansplained my own work. And as that happened, an ally, a cis white man, raised his hand and said, hey, I think, it's her turn to talk. I agree with Kat said. And it's something as simple as saying that, is repeating what somebody said and giving them credit. I think that goes a long ways with power dynamics too.
So on my end, conversations are great, right? I love conversations. I think everyone should have them, especially if it's something this important as power dynamics. At the same time, sometimes it starts with the awareness first. And so before jumping into conversations, I'm just thinking of my environment here and where I'm at. And so I don't think we're even aware from the beginning of power dynamics. And so to me, if you're in an environment like that, where your community, or if you're working in a small space or an environment where people are just totally unaware of what power dynamics are, and that it's at play and that it's at work, because it's always at play and it's always at work in a lot of different cases, whether that's your work environment or not your work environment. It could be at home. It's happening in my community, just among people. And so that's not even my team, right? That's not even who I work for. It's just everywhere. And so creating the awareness first that it's there, I think, is important, and then diving into conversations. And then once you feel comfortable enough to reach those conversational pieces, at that point, to me, it's important to say, hey, this is how this makes me feel. This is what's happening. This is, to me, some ideas how we can improve moving forward. So I want to go ahead and answer that first question with, I'd prefer awareness first before diving into a conversation, because right now where I'm at, it's in its beginning stages, truly. And so some places may be like my own, where it's just in the beginning stages, where it's not even a thought in someone's mind. It's not even something they're aware of. And I think of my coworker who is like, what is that? I don't even know what that means. It's defining what power dynamics is. Let's define that first. Let's unpack that. We have to unpack in layers before we really get to the deep work, right? So that's one thing I would say to that question. On the second one, I kind of want to flip the script here. So I want to say at some point I was a privileged identity, and that's that's weird to say because I am Native American. I mean, we're very low on the totem pole when it comes to talking about issues that come to Native communities. Whether you go to diversity workshops or inclusivity trainings, things like that, we're kind of the last group that gets talked about, and it hurts. But you know, I had a team who were tasked to recruit Native students at a university I used to work for. And so they were my team who I assigned them to schools out on the reservation, right? And so for them, they felt marginalized in that situation because they're like, how am I supposed to speak effectively to Native programs or Native issues or things that are relevant to this group? And you know, I did have some situations where they felt uncomfortable. And so, you know, it's like, hey, now you know what it feels like. It feels different, right? When someone doesn't trust you, someone doesn't understand where you're coming from. So in that space, in that time, I was the one in a privileged identity. It was my job to vocalize and advocate for them and say, this is my team. And I tried to support them in the best way to say, hey, you may not identify as Native, you may not know a whole lot about Native programs, but we're going to get there and we're going to do this and we're going to do it effectively because I have you, I have your back, I support you. And even then, Native communities are more than just one Native community. There's over 150 different tribal communities out there. So then how to effectively speak on behalf of your own tribe, but also many, that's pretty difficult. And so in those spaces and in that time, it's important to just have that person know you have their back. And I would expect the same from someone who isn't Native to allow my voice to be amplified, much like what Katarina is saying. Someone should be there to amplify that. And so that way, if it's not you and you don't have that capability, we would hope that that person in that privileged space will do that for you or for a group. It doesn't have to be an individual. It can be a group of people too. So that's my take on those two questions. And so hopefully that provides a bit of perspective.
Thank you all so much for that insight. It is greatly appreciated. For the sake of time, I definitely want to make sure that we are being mindful. We are being mindful of time because of the fact that we have essentially about 5 minutes. So you all have covered all the major topics that we've wanted to address and pinpoint. So we definitely do want to provide some time for any attendees to ask questions that they may have that we may have not addressed. So we just wanted to check in with the people in attendance. Do you have any lingering questions in our last 5 minutes for the panelists? Okay. So because for the sake of time, we definitely want our panelists to share just final thoughts as we wrap up. Essentially, is there anything that you didn't get to talk about that you definitely want to make sure that people are aware of before we depart from this space?
I have one quick thing. In my work as a chamber, I do a lot of research about businesses or read a lot of research about business culture, and that includes power dynamics. And a really good litmus to see power dynamics, which is like this nebulous idea, is to see staff turnover rate. And that sounds weird. People may leave for many different reasons, but there are websites where you can look at power dynamics and where businesses are rated. And so in job interviews, I always ask why the last person left. And if they hem and haw and give you like weird nebulous answers, that's kind of a warning sign to me. Whereas if they said, hey, they worked here for 2 years, but they wanted to take a job in management, that says something different than they wanted a new opportunity, because if I would ask, what opportunities did they leave for that you're not providing here?
I just wanted to thank Career Services and SDSJ for inviting me for this panel and allowing me to share my voice and my experiences with everyone here, as well as, thank you so much to the panelists for sharing all of your experiences. Because I do work at UNLV, I work in our SIA office, I just wanted to make sure that I mention that I am absolutely available to any student, alumni, anyone here who is attending, as well as anyone's here who's tuning in to our recorded video afterwards, that I'm here. I would love to elaborate on anything I've said, share more about my experiences with you if they've resonated with you, if you're more curious to learn more. And I also want to make sure that I make myself available to you if you need any support of any kind, whether it's power dynamics, power differential related or not. So I just definitely wanted to mention that before we part.
All right, any other final thoughts? Yes, definitely. This was a great talk, great session, very valuable information. If there's nothing else that wants to be said by the panelists, then that essentially is the end of our session. So next week, we're actually going to have another Thursday Thoughts session that will actually focus on navigating imposter syndrome, just because for many of us that has come up both in the workplace and outside of the workplace. But nonetheless, this is brought to you by Career Services as well as Student Diversity and Social Justice. We really appreciate you all for coming, and please be sure to fill out the survey, just because we thrive off of student-centered feedback to make sure that we are tailoring these programs to the needs and concerns and the questions that students are having as they navigate through their potential careers, but also navigate their education. But nonetheless, we really do appreciate you all joining us today. So thank you.